I witnessed death retreat. I saw the impossible happen before my very eyes. The man had been dead for 4 days, his body already decomposing, wrapped in linen strips soaked in myrrh and aloes. The smell, that unmistakable smell of death that we all fear, already permeated the air around the tomb. No one, absolutely no one, expected what would happen that afternoon in Bethany. No one, except him. My name is Eleazar. I was 42 years old when it all happened. I'm a potter from Bethany, a small village on the outskirts of Jerusalem. My workshop was near the house of 3 siblings everyone knew: Martha, Mary, and Lazarus. Good people, honest. Lazarus was my distant cousin, but we were as close as brothers since childhood. We lived in difficult times. Rome dominated our land with an iron fist. Taxes crushed our people, and at any sign of rebellion, crucifixions occurred by the dozens along the roads. Roman soldiers patrolled our streets, constantly reminding us that we were not free. Pilate, the Roman governor, was known for his cruelty and impatience with any threat to imperial order. And then there were the Pharisees and Sadducees, our religious leaders, who had turned the law of Moses into an unbearable burden. They looked at me with contempt because I was a simple man who couldn't follow all the rituals and purifications they demanded. To them, I was unclean, unworthy of God's favor. I used to wake up before sunrise like most craftsmen. The clay needed to be prepared early, when it was still moist with morning dew. My hands were always cracked, calloused. My wife, Deborah, and our 3 small children depended on what I could sell in the marketplace. It wasn't always enough. Many nights we went to bed hungry. The truth is that back then, I lived with bitterness in my heart. I watched the rich get richer, the temple priests exploit the poor, charging for purification sacrifices they knew we could barely afford. The God I knew from synagogue teachings seemed distant, concerned only with rules and rituals. I still went to the celebrations, of course. Everyone did. But inside I doubted that he cared about people like me. I remember one particularly difficult morning. A Roman centurion had broken several of my best pottery pieces, claiming they were blocking the passage, though they were clearly within the boundaries of my property. I could do nothing. Challenging a Roman soldier could mean flogging or worse. I swallowed my humiliation and anger as I watched weeks of work destroyed in the dust. It was that afternoon when I saw Lazarus for the first time in weeks. He had been traveling, accompanying an itinerant teacher from Nazareth, a man called Jesus. Lazarus seemed different. There was a peace in his eyes that I didn't recognize, a certainty I didn't understand. "Eleazar," he said to me, helping me collect the broken pieces of pottery, "you need to meet him. He's not like other teachers. His words, it's as if they could reach places inside us that we didn't even know existed." I just shook my head, skeptical. We had seen many men proclaiming themselves prophets, teachers, even the Messiah himself. They almost always ended up crucified by the Romans, leaving their followers disillusioned or dead. "Just another one who will disappoint you," I replied. Bitter? Lazarus wasn't offended by my incredulity. He simply smiled and said, "When you're ready, come to my house. He visits us frequently." Then he placed his hand on my shoulder and added, "He has answers to those questions I see in your eyes, my friend. Questions you can't even express in words." How did he know about the questions that tormented me on sleepless nights? The doubts that corroded me from within. In that moment, I felt a shiver run down my spine, but I quickly brushed away that sensation. I had work to do, mouths to feed. Months passed. Occasionally, I heard stories about this Jesus. They said he healed the sick, spoke with an authority that infuriated the Pharisees, forgave sins, something only God could do. Opinions were divided. Some called him a blasphemer, others a prophet, and others still whispered the word we dared not say aloud for fear of the Romans: Messiah. Meanwhile, I noticed that Lazarus was growing thinner. At first, I thought it was just fatigue from traveling with his teacher. but then he started coughing blood. His skin took on a pallor we knew well, the harbinger of death. Mary and Martha were desperate. Physicians were called. Medicinal herbs were applied. Nothing worked. On a particularly cold night, I was called to their house. Lazarus was very ill. His sisters had sent messengers to find Jesus, who was preaching beyond the Jordan. "If he comes in time," Martha told me, her eyes red from so much, crying, "I know he can save my brother." I felt sorry for them, so much faith placed in a man who would probably not arrive in time. Death waits for no one, not even for itinerant prophets. I sat beside Lazarus's bed while Mary moistened his parched lips with a damp cloth. He opened his eyes, those eyes already partially covered by death's veil, and recognized me. "Eleazar," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Promise me something." I leaned closer to hear better. "When he comes, because he will come, stay, watch, and afterward, tell everyone what you saw." I nodded, more to comfort him than because I believed Jesus would come, or that if he came, he could make any difference. Lazarus died the following dawn. I was there, along with several other residents of Bethany. I saw his last breath. I saw the exact moment when life abandoned his body, and I saw the heart-wrenching pain of his sisters. Mary thrown over the lifeless body, Martha trying to stay strong but collapsing in sobs. The ritual preparation of the body began immediately, as our tradition required. The body was carefully washed, perfumed with expensive oils. Lazarus was a respected man from a wealthy family. Then it was wrapped in linen strips, with aromatic herbs between the layers to delay the odor of decomposition. All this done quickly, as our custom was to bury the dead on the same day of death. The procession to the tomb was accompanied by the entire village. Lazarus was loved. Many wept openly. Others chanted psalms of lamentation. The body was placed in a tomb carved into the rock, and a large stone was rolled to close the entrance. It would remain there for a year, until only the bones remained, and then these would be placed in a family ossuary. According to custom, the next 7 days would be of intense mourning. Martha and Mary's house was full of people offering condolences, bringing food, sharing stories about Lazarus. I came and went, helping where I could. My wife, Deborah, stayed with the grieving sisters for several days. On the 3rd day after the burial, I heard a murmur. Jesus and his followers had been seen near the town. Too late, I thought bitterly. What kind of friend arrives after there's nothing left to be done? I was in the house helping serve visitors when Martha hurried out. I later learned that she had gone to meet Jesus on the outskirts of the village. Mary remained seated, immersed in her grief, receiving condolences from visitors from Jerusalem. Many of them important, as Bethany was so close to the holy city that even Pharisees and Sadducees had come to offer their sympathies. A few moments later, Martha returned. She seemed different. There was still sadness in her eyes, but also something more, a spark that wasn't there before. She approached Mary and whispered something in her ear. Mary rose immediately and left the house. Intrigued, and remembering the promise I made to Lazarus, I discreetly followed her. Mary headed outside the village to the same place where Jesus was apparently waiting. Many of those who were in the house followed her, thinking she was going to the tomb to weep, as was common in the first days of mourning. I blended into this impromptu procession. That's when I saw him for the first time. Jesus. He wasn't what I expected. Nothing in his physical appearance suggested he was someone special, a man of average height, dressed like any common Jew, perhaps with the signs of the sun and the road more evident on his face. But his eyes. There was something in his eyes that made me stop where I stood. A depth, a compassion, an authority I had never seen in any other man. Mary fell at his feet, sobbing. "Lord," she said through tears, "if you had been here, my brother would not have died." The pain in her voice was palpable. Everyone around, including some of the visitors from Jerusalem, began to cry. The loss was recent, the wound still fresh. Then, something happened that I'll never forget. I saw Jesus' face contort in an expression of deep anguish, his eyes filled with tears that soon flowed freely down his face. Jesus wept. I was perplexed. Why would a teacher, a supposed prophet, cry like this? If he had as much power as they said, why hadn't he come sooner? Why allow his friend to die? Some around me whispered the same questions. Could not this man, who opened the eyes of the blind, have kept Lazarus from dying? Jesus, still visibly moved, asked, "Where have you laid him?" "Come and see, Lord," replied Martha and Mary, and began to lead the way to the tomb. A crowd quickly formed. Jesus' followers, the residents of Bethany, the visitors from Jerusalem, all following toward Lazarus' grave. I stayed close, determined to fulfill my promise, observing every movement, every word. We arrived at the tomb, a cave with a large circular stone blocking the entrance. 4 days had passed. According to our beliefs, after 3 days the soul definitively left the body, making any hope of return impossible. Moreover, in our hot climate, decomposition would already be advanced. Jesus stood in silence before the tomb for a few moments. His expression had changed. The tears had dried, and now his eyes reflected an unwavering determination. He looked at the large stone and said firmly, "Take away the stone." Martha, always practical, expressed what we were all thinking. "Lord, by this time there is a bad odor, for he has been there 4 days." What Jesus said next sent chills down to my very core. "Did I not tell you that if you believed you would see the glory of God?" Glory of God? What did he intend to do? We all knew it was too late for anything. Lazarus was dead. Definitely dead. The natural and irreversible process of decomposition had already begun. Some men, hesitant but obedient, approached the stone and began to move it aside. A putrid odor immediately escaped from the tomb, confirming what we all knew. Death had done its work. The murmur of the crowd ceased. A heavy, tense silence took over the place. All eyes were fixed on Jesus, who stood before the open entrance of the tomb, looking into the darkness where my friend's body lay. Then Jesus lifted his eyes to heaven and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me." And then he did something no one expected. With a voice louder than he had used until then, a voice that seemed to resonate throughout Bethany, he cried out, "Lazarus, come out!" The echo of his words still reverberated in the still afternoon air when something began to move in the darkness of the tomb. A sound of fabric rubbing against stone, a movement in the shadow. My heart nearly stopped, and then a figure appeared at the entrance. Standing, moving, completely wrapped in linen strips from head to foot, like an Egyptian mummy, the face covered by a cloth, but unmistakably standing, alive. It was Lazarus, my friend. The man I had seen take his last breath 4 days before. The man whose body I helped prepare for burial. The man who, minutes before, we knew was in an advanced state of decomposition. He was there, standing, alive. The silence that followed was absolute, a silence laden with astonishment, fear, disbelief. No one moved, no one breathed. It was as if time itself had stopped. Jesus, with the same calmness as someone asking to pass the salt during a meal, said, "Take off the grave clothes and let him go." It was at that moment that I realized my legs had lost all strength. I fell to my knees, trembling uncontrollably, not out of fear, but because something inside me was being completely shattered and rebuilt in that instant. All the doubts, all the bitterness, all the disbelief, all of it dissolved like mist under the strong sun. What I had just witnessed wasn't just a miracle, it was impossible. It was the very denial of the laws of nature. It was divine. While some, still in a state of shock, timidly approached to help remove the strips from Lazarus's body, revealing to everyone's astonishment, healthy, rosy skin, without any sign of death or decomposition, I remained motionless, unable to take my eyes off the figure of Jesus. Who was he after all? What man had power over death itself? In that moment, for the first time in my adult life, I felt something I had forgotten. Hope. A hope so intense, so overwhelming, that it physically hurt in my chest. If death, our last and most feared enemy, could be defeated like this with a simple command, then perhaps, just perhaps, everything else that oppressed us could also be defeated. The Roman Empire, the oppression of the religious elites, poverty, fear, hopelessness. As Lazarus embraced his sisters amid tears and laughter and exclamations of joy, as the crowd erupted in cries of amazement and worship, as some of the Pharisees present moved away with expressions of horror and hatred. I remained on my knees, looking at Jesus, and then, for a brief moment, his eyes met mine. It was just an instant, but I felt as if he could see through me, to the bottom of my soul. As if he knew every pain, every doubt, every moment of anger I had ever felt, and yet there was no judgment in his gaze, only understanding, acceptance, and a silent invitation. That day, something died inside me too. The bitter, skeptical, hopeless man I had become. And something new began to be born in its place. Little did I know that this miracle, this resurrection I witnessed with my own eyes, would be just the beginning. Little did I know that the story of Lazarus would spread like wildfire, reaching the ears of the chief priests in Jerusalem and of Pilate himself. Little did I know that from that day forward, my life would never be the same again, because I was there. I was there when he raised Lazarus from the dead, and because of that, I could never look at life, or death, the same way again. It has been just 1 year since that day in Bethany. 1 year since I saw death retreat before the very words of a man. Sometimes I wake in the middle of the night covered in sweat, thinking perhaps it was only a dream. But then I remember Lazarus's face as the burial cloths were removed, the expressions of astonishment on the Pharisees' faces, the smell of death being replaced by the aroma of life, and I know with a certainty I've never before possessed that it was real as the air I now breathe. The weeks following Lazarus's resurrection were confusing and intense. The news spread faster than any rumor I had ever witnessed. First, throughout Bethany, then to neighboring villages, and within days all of Jerusalem was buzzing with stories about the miracle. Some accounts were exaggerated, of course. People spoke of how the heavens had opened, of how a divine light had enveloped the tomb. They needed no such embellishments. The bare truth was extraordinary enough. Lazarus became something of an attraction. People traveled for days to see him, to touch him, to confirm with their own eyes that it was really him, the man who had returned from the other side. Some came driven by genuine faith, others out of morbid curiosity. Many left their encounter with Lazarus transformed, converted, believing in Jesus as the Messiah. And it was precisely this that began to cause problems. The Romans were already nervous about constant talk of a king of the Jews. Any mention of the word Messiah was treated as potential sedition. And now, suddenly, crowds were gathering, openly speaking of Jesus as the promised deliverer of Israel. But it wasn't the Romans who reacted first. It was our own religious leaders. Remember it clearly. It was the end of a hot afternoon, about 2 weeks after the miracle. I was in my workshop working on a large order of jars. My business had improved considerably, as many of the pilgrims who came to see Lazarus ended up passing by my shop. Attracted by the story of the potter who witnessed the miracle, 3 men entered without announcing themselves. I recognized them immediately by their elaborate robes and air of superiority. 2 Sadducees and a Pharisee, members of the Sanhedrin, the religious council that governed many aspects of our Jewish life. Eleazar, son of Joash, asked the eldest of them, a man with a graying beard and eyes as cold as stone. I nodded, drying my hands on my apron. We need to speak about the incident with your cousin. Incident. That's what they called the greatest manifestation of divine power our people had witnessed in generations. What is there to speak about? I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. I merely saw what I saw. "And what exactly did you see?" insisted the second man, younger, with a calculating gaze. "Because we have reports that you've been spreading rather problematic stories." I took a deep breath. Here it was, the moment of choice. I could deny, minimize, say I had exaggerated. It would be safest. Or I could affirm what I knew to be true, despite knowing the consequences. I thought of Jesus' gaze that day, of the peace I felt when his eyes met mine. "I saw a man dead for 4 days walk out of his tomb when Jesus of Nazareth called him," I said, with a clarity and conviction that surprised even me. "I saw the Messiah command death to retreat, and it obeyed." The silence that followed was oppressive. The 3 men looked at me as if I had blasphemed. And, according to their interpretation, I had. "Do you know what you're saying?" The eldest took a step forward. "You're claiming that this itinerant carpenter is the anointed one of God?" "I'm stating what I saw," I answered, "and I leave you to draw your own conclusions." The third man, who had remained silent until then, spoke with a surprisingly gentle voice. "Eleazar, you are a respected man in this community. You have a family to care for. Think carefully before associating yourself with this movement. The Romans will not tolerate this kind of agitation for long. And we have our own concerns about false prophets." The threat was clear, though veiled. "We're here to advise you," he continued. "Stop talking about this matter. Tell people you were confused, that you didn't clearly see what happened, that perhaps Lazarus had merely fallen into a deep sleep and awoke at the right time. Anything to calm these dangerous stories of resurrection and Messiah." I looked at the pottery pieces in my workshop, at the work of my hands, at the life I had built with such effort. "And if I don't?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. The oldest man responded without beating around the bush. "Then you will be put out of the synagogue. No Jew will be able to trade with you, speak to you, have any contact with your family. It will be as if you were dead." Excommunication. The worst punishment for a Jew, short of death itself. It would mean total ruin, not just spiritual but economic and social. They left without waiting for my response, confident that fear would do its work. That night, I told my wife Deborah about the conversation. My wife had always been a woman of silent, deep faith. She listened attentively, her eyes fixed on the flames of the small oil lamp that illuminated our table. "What will you do?" she finally asked, her voice almost a whisper. I realized that my answer would define not only my own destiny, but hers and our children's as well. If I deny what I saw, if I say it wasn't real, it would be like denying God himself, I replied, feeling the weight of each word. "I cannot do that, Deborah, even if it means losing everything." I expected to see fear in her eyes, anger perhaps. After all, my decision would affect the entire family. But what I saw was something different, something that surprised me. "Was there too," she said, holding my calloused hands in hers. "Not as close as you, but I saw Lazarus come out of that tomb. I heard Jesus call him by name. And if this man has power over death, then what can we fear? What can the Sanhedrin really do against us?" Her eyes shone, not with tears, but with a quiet certainty. "Besides," she continued with a small smile, "for someone who claims not to believe, you've spent quite a lot of time following this Jesus around the countryside." It was true. Since the miracle, I had sought every opportunity to hear Jesus teach. I left the workshop in the care of my eldest son and went wherever Jesus was, usually not far, as he spent more and more time in the vicinity of Jerusalem. I mingled with the crowd, absorbing every word, and what words they were. So different from the dry sermons of the Pharisees, full of rules and condemnations. Jesus spoke about a kingdom that was not of this world, but that began within our hearts. About a God who was like a loving father, not a stern judge. About the true meaning of the law of Moses, to love God and neighbor. In his words, I found answers to questions I didn't even know I had. And increasingly, this God he spoke of, a close personal God concerned with our suffering, made sense to me. There was one teaching in particular that marked me. Jesus was speaking about the hypocrisy of the religious leaders, how they placed heavy burdens on people's shoulders, burdens they themselves would not carry. "You are like whitewashed tombs," he said, his voice carrying a righteous indignation. "On the outside they appear beautiful, but inside they are full of dead, men's bones and everything unclean." I nearly choked when I heard that. It was the purest truth, spoken with a courage I had never witnessed. The Pharisees present turned livid but could not retort. The authority with which Jesus spoke was undeniable. In that moment, I understood that he was not merely a miracle worker. He wasn't just healing bodies and raising the dead. He was challenging an entire corrupt religious system that had long forgotten the true purpose of God for our people. And that's why, that night, sitting at the table with Deborah, I made my decision. "I will not deny what I saw," I said firmly. "Even if it means losing everything, I cannot deny the truth." The next day, word came that the Sanhedrin had met secretly and decided that Jesus must die. Not only that, there were rumors they planned to kill Lazarus too, to eliminate the living proof of the miracle. I ran to Lazarus's house to warn him and his sisters. I found Mary in the garden, gathering herbs. Her face, once always marked by a gentle melancholy, now radiated a peace I had never seen. "We already know," she told me when I shared the news. "Jesus warned us this would happen." "You need to leave Bethany," I insisted. "Go somewhere distant, at least until the situation calms down." Mary smiled, a smile that seemed to contain some secret knowledge. "My brother has already died once, Eleazar. Do you think he fears dying again?" As for Jesus, she paused, looking at the clear spring sky. "He walks toward his destiny with eyes wide open. He says that's why he came." I didn't fully understand what she meant at that moment. Only later, much later, would her words make sense. In the days that followed, tension throughout the region grew to almost unbearable levels. It was the time of Passover, and Jerusalem was full of pilgrims from all parts. The air seemed charged with electricity, like before a great storm. And then, something happened that no one could have predicted. Jesus, who until then had avoided great public demonstrations in Jerusalem, rode openly into the city, mounted on a young donkey, as in the ancient prophecies about the Messiah. The crowd went wild. They spread cloaks and palm branches on the ground, shouting, "Hosanna! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord! Blessed is the King of Israel!" I was there, with Deborah and our children. We saw everything. The joy of the crowd, the horror on the faces of the Pharisees and Sadducees, the concern of the Roman soldiers, hands on their swords, ready to react at the slightest sign of revolt. "He is proclaiming himself king," whispered Deborah, incredulous. "The Romans will never allow this." She was right, of course. Proclaiming oneself king was an act of direct rebellion against Caesar, punishable by the most painful death the Romans had invented, crucifixion. At the same time, for us Jews, the image of Jesus entering Jerusalem in that specific manner was loaded with messianic significance. He was deliberately fulfilling the prophecies, declaring himself not just a king, but the king, the promised descendant of David who would liberate Israel. But what kind of liberation was he seeking? That was the question that confounded both his followers and his enemies. Because, you see, we all expected a warrior Messiah, someone who would expel the Romans by force, who would restore the throne of Israel, who would return to us the glory of Solomon's time. But Jesus spoke of a kingdom that was not of this world, of a revolution that began in the heart. In the days following his triumphal entry into Jerusalem, Jesus taught openly in the temple, challenging the religious leaders with parables that clearly criticized them, responding to their verbal traps with a wisdom that left them speechless. I went every day to hear his teachings, fascinated by his courage and clarity. Increasingly, I became convinced this man was not just a prophet. He was more than that, much more. But I also felt the danger growing around him, the hateful glares of the Sadducees, the whispers of the temple guards, the Roman spies observing attentively. the net closing in. One afternoon, as I returned home after a day at the temple, I was approached by 3 men in a narrow, deserted street. I recognized one of them. He was one of the temple guards who always accompanied the high priest Caiaphas. "The Sanhedrin wants to talk to you, Potter," he said, gripping my arm tightly. I immediately knew it wasn't an invitation, but an arrest. "Why?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "You continue to spread stories about that body in Bethany. About the Nazarene bringing the dead back to life. They aren't stories," I replied. "It's the truth. I was there." The man smiled, a cold smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Well, now you'll have the chance to tell that truth to the Sanhedrin. We'll see what they think." I thought of my family, of Deborah waiting with dinner prepared, of my children who had not yet returned from the fields. I thought of my promise to Lazarus. "When he comes, stay, watch, and afterward tell everyone what you saw." I had kept that promise so far, but at what cost? When we arrived at the courtyard where the Sanhedrin met, I immediately knew something was wrong. There was no formal session of the council, just a small group of Sadducees, temple guards, and in the center, the high priest Caiaphas himself. "Is this him?" asked Caiaphas, barely looking at me. "Yes, sir," replied the guard. "The potter who has been spreading stories about the Nazarene." Caiaphas finally turned his eyes to me, sharp, calculating eyes. The eyes of a man accustomed to power and determined to keep it. "You've been causing a lot of trouble, Potter," he said. "More than you imagine." "I've only told what I saw," I answered, keeping my voice as steady as possible. "What you saw," he repeated with disdain, "is putting our nation at risk. The Romans are watching. At the slightest sign of rebellion, they will crush us like insects. Thousands will die. The temple will be desecrated, all because people like you insist on spreading stories about a false Messiah." I felt my anger growing, momentarily overcoming my fear. False? I saw him bring Lazarus back from death. With my own eyes, I saw him. Caiaphas made a dismissive gesture with his hand. "Tricks, illusions, or perhaps your friend was never really dead. There are many more reasonable explanations than believing that a carpenter from Galilee has power over death." I looked around at the faces of the other men present. In some, I saw the same disdain as Caiaphas. In others, something different. Doubt, curiosity, perhaps even fear. "And what if they weren't tricks?" I asked, surprised by my own boldness. "What if he really is who he claims to be? What if you're fighting against God himself?" A murmur ran through the group. Caiaphas rose abruptly, his face contorted with anger. "Blasphemy!" he shouted. "This man blasphemes like his master." He tore his garments, the traditional gesture of indignation in the face of blasphemy. But there was something too theatrical about his gesture, as if he were simply fulfilling a role he had already rehearsed. "What shall we do with him?" asked one of the other Sadducees. Caiaphas studied me for a moment, then his face relaxed into a cold smile. "Nothing. For now. He isn't important, he's just a tool being used to spread lies." He approached me, his face inches from mine. "But soon, very soon, your Messiah will be dead. And then we'll see how many still believe these stories." I was released, but with a clear warning. I was being watched. Any suspicious movement, any word in favor of Jesus, and my family would pay the price. I returned home shaken, but also with a clarity I didn't have before. The confrontation with Caiaphas had solidified my conviction. It wasn't just Jesus's miracles that convinced me. It was the desperate reaction of the powerful, the fear that showed through their anger. If Jesus were just another false Messiah, why so much effort to silence him? Why not let him simply disappear, like so many others? Before him, upon arriving home, I found Deborah in tears, surrounded by our children. 2 men from the Sanhedrin had passed by while I was detained. They had ransacked our house, broken some of my most valuable pieces, and left a warning. If I continued talking about Jesus and Lazarus, we would all be expelled not just from the synagogue, but from Bethany. I embraced my family, trying to convey a confidence that I myself didn't completely feel. "What will we do now?" asked Deborah, when the children had finally fallen asleep. I looked at our few possessions, at the humble roof that sheltered us, at my wife's hands that had worked tirelessly by my side for so many years. "It would be easier to deny," I said honestly. "To say I exaggerated, that I'm not sure about what I saw." Deborah nodded, her eyes fixed on mine. "It would be easier," she agreed. But would it be true? We both knew the answer. That night we made a decision. We wrapped our most important possessions and sent them to a cousin's house in Joppa on the coast. We would do the same with the children the next morning. As for us, we would stay. We needed to see what would happen next, because a feeling was growing in my chest. Something was about to happen, something terrible and wonderful at the same time. The following days passed in a blur of tension and expectation. The city buzzed with rumors. Jesus had challenged the money changers in the temple, overturning their tables and calling the sacred place a den of thieves. The religious leaders were beside themselves. The Romans reinforced the guard. And then, on the night of the Passover meal, everything changed. I was preparing to celebrate the Seder with my family when they knocked at our door. It was a breathless young man, one of Jesus's followers whom I knew by sight. "They've arrested him," he said, barely able to catch his breath. "In the Garden of Gethsemane, Judas betrayed him. They're taking him to Caiaphas right now." My heart sank. It was what I feared. What we all feared, though Jesus seemed strangely prepared for it. "I'm going there," I told Deborah, grabbing my cloak. She held my arm, her eyes full of fear. "But the warning? If they see you..." I promised I would. "Tell what I saw," I replied. "I need to see what will happen now." In the last week, Jesus hadn't stopped alluding to his own death. "The Son of Man must suffer greatly," he said. He spoke of being betrayed, flogged, crucified. But he also spoke of rising on the third day. Rising. Like Lazarus. Could it be possible? He who had power over the death of others, would he have power over his own death? I needed to know. I needed to see. I've never told anyone the complete details of what I witnessed that night when Jesus was arrested, nor about the dark days that followed. That's a story for another time, a story even more difficult to believe than the resurrection of Lazarus. But today, 1 year after seeing my friend walk out of the tomb, I want to talk about how that miracle changed me, about the lessons I learned watching death retreat before the voice of a man who, I now firmly believe, was much more than just a man. Before that day in Bethany, I lived as many of us do, caught between fear and resignation. Fear of the Romans, fear of poverty, fear of judgment from religious leaders, and resignation to a life that seemed predetermined, limited by the circumstances of my birth and the oppression we endured. I believed in God, of course. We all did. But it was a distant God. A God who had spoken to our ancestors but seemed to have fallen silent in recent centuries. A God who perhaps had already given up on his chosen people. And then, on an ordinary afternoon, in a small village of no importance, I saw this same God break the silence in such an undeniable, overwhelming way that no human explanation could account for it. What did I really learn from seeing Lazarus walk out of the tomb? First, I learned that death doesn't have the final word. It seems obvious to say this now, but think about what it truly means. We live our entire lives under death's shadow, don't we? All our effort, our work, our struggles, everything seems so temporary when we remember that one day it will all end. That one day will be just dust. But on that day, I saw a man who had crossed that final threshold, that portal through which we all eventually pass, and I saw him return. I saw life come back to a body already in decomposition. I saw the impossible happen, and if death is not the end, then everything changes, doesn't it? The entire meaning of life changes. The second lesson was more personal, more intimate. Lazarus was my friend, my own blood. I loved him. And yet when Jesus asked where they had laid him, even though I was there, even believing this man had extraordinary, Powers, I didn't expect a miracle. I didn't ask for one. I didn't truly believe it could happen. Who was I to ask for the resurrection of someone I loved? Who was I to expect the laws of nature to be suspended for my sake? But Jesus didn't ask if I deserved it. He didn't ask if I had enough faith. He simply acted, out of love for Lazarus, out of love for his sisters, out of love for all of us who loved him. And that taught me something about God's nature that all my years in the synagogue had failed to teach. That his love and power don't depend on our worthiness or merit. That he sees our pain and responds to it not because we deserve it, but because of who he is. The third lesson came later in the days that followed. I observed how people reacted to the miracle. Some, like me, were profoundly transformed, saw their doubts dissolve, their faith awaken or renew. Others, especially those with power and status, reacted with fear, anger, denial. Even in the face of the most incontrovertible evidence of divine power, they chose not to believe. Not because they couldn't see the truth, but because the truth threatened everything they had built. This made me understand that faith is not just a matter of evidence. It's also a matter of the heart's disposition, of being willing to let truth transform us even when that transformation comes at a cost. And the cost was high, wasn't it? For many of us who witnessed the miracle and chose to believe, the cost was our security, our social position, sometimes even our families and livelihoods. But what we gained in return, an understanding of God that our ancestors only glimpsed, a certainty that goes beyond what we can see and touch, a hope that not even death can extinguish. Lazarus is no longer in Bethany. After everything that happened in Jerusalem, it became too dangerous for him to remain in Judea. His enemies still seek him, determined to erase the living evidence of Jesus' power. I've heard he's now in Cyprus, taking the story of what happened to him to people who have never heard of Jesus, people who desperately need hope. Mary and Martha still live in Bethany, though they rarely leave home. There are always crowds wanting to see them, talk to them, touch the place where the miracle happened. They endure it all with grace, though sometimes I see the weariness in their eyes. As for me, well, I'm no longer just the potter of Bethany. To some, I'm a madman who ruined his own life because of a fantastic story. To others, I'm a witness, someone they seek out when their own doubts become too heavy. We had to move, of course. The Sanhedrin's threat eventually came to fruition. I was formally excommunicated 3 months after the miracle, when I refused to stop talking about what I'd seen. No observant Jew could trade with me, speak to me, or even acknowledge my existence anymore. But curiously, this opened new doors. We moved to a small village near Joppa, where my cousin already lived. There, I found a community, small, but growing, of people who, like me, had their lives transformed by an encounter with Jesus. Some had seen him personally, others had only heard the stories, but all share the same conviction, that he was who he claimed to be. My workshop now is even simpler than it was in Bethany, but I never lack for work. People come from far away to buy pieces made by the potter who saw Lazarus resurrected. Some come just out of curiosity, of course, but many come seeking something more, seeking hope, confirmation, a faith that can withstand even death. And for them, I tell my story, the same one I'm telling you today, not as someone seeking to convince or convert, but as someone simply sharing what they saw, what they lived, what they know to be true. Sometimes at night, I still have nightmares. I dream of the smell of the tomb, of the horror in the eyes of those present, of the moment of suspension when Jesus called and nothing happened, until it did. But then I wake up and I remember that the story doesn't end with Lazarus, that there is another resurrection, even more powerful, even more transformative. A resurrection that changed everything, forever. But that's a story for another day, a day when I have the strength to relive those dark hours in Jerusalem, the trial, the cross, the empty tomb. For today, I leave you with this certainty that I've carried with me since that afternoon in Bethany, that there is a power greater than death, that there is a hope that cannot be buried, that no tomb is final when God Himself calls your name. I was there when He raised Lazarus from the dead, and nothing, not persecution, not excommunication, not even the threat of death, can make me deny what I saw, because whoever beholds the power of God face to face can no longer live in the shadow of doubt. Whoever sees death retreat before life can no longer fear what men can do. This is my story. What you do with it depends on your own heart. But if something in my words has awakened a spark of faith, of hope, of desire for the divine, then perhaps, just perhaps you too have been touched by the same power that brought Lazarus back to life. And if that has happened, share it, because the world is hungry for hope, hungry for certainty, hungry for a God who is not trapped in the scrolls of the Torah, but who walks among us, who weeps with us, who conquers death for us. I was there. I saw. And I will be telling this story until my last breath. In another occasion, God willing, I'll tell you what I saw in those days in Jerusalem, about the trial, about the cross, about the most impossible of miracles. But for today, take with you just this. Not even death has the final word. Not for Lazarus, not for Jesus, not for us. Share, like, and follow this channel if this story touched your heart.